Hello everyone, welcome to this video. In this video, we're going to be looking at starting the different network services in Kali Linux. And you might be sitting there asking yourself, why do we need to do this? Well, essentially, Kali Linux comes bundled with several network services that are very useful in different situations. Alright, they're going to be disabled by default. Now, looking at some of these services, we have the Apache 2 service, which allows us to run a local web server, which is awesome. We then have the SSH service, which essentially is the secure shell that allows us to communicate between two computers securely, which is again very important. And we're going to be looking at how to start these services. Alright, so let's get started really. Now, again, we looked at this previously in the previous video when we were talking about proxy chains and how to start the Tor service. So the syntax is very simple to start a service. We essentially go with service, Apache 2, which is the service name, and what we want to do. So in this case, we want to start it, but remember, we can restart it, we can stop it. Alright, so once we hit start, it's going to start the Apache 2 service, and there we are. Now, if I copied files or I actually moved web applications into the localhost files, into the localhost directory, I would be able to actually access them through my browser with the localhost, which is awesome. Alright, now let's look at the secure shell, which is very important, and I'm going to elaborate on this a little bit more. So to start the SSH service, we essentially use service, SSH, and start. And once that's started, that's awesome. We already have a good starting point here. Now you might be asking, can you elaborate a little bit more on why SSH is so important? Well, SSH allows you to connect between two computers, right? And you can perform commands and you essentially have full control over that computer remotely and securely. Alright, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and connect to this Kali Linux machine from my Windows operating system. And I'm going to do this using a tool called PuTTY. So if you're not familiar with PuTTY, PuTTY is essentially an SSH client that allows you to connect to different client servers all around the world. Alright, but before we start, we need to know the IP address for the Kali Linux machine. This is very important. Since we're on local area network, we already know the local address is going to be an IP on the network. So that is 192.168.1.106. Alright, now since we already know that, we need to remember what the SSH port is. Now again, I'm going to ask you, if you do not know what the SSH port is, the SSH port is really the port through which the connection is made. And if you've gone through the SSH port, you will know that the SSH port is port 22. Alright, now that is very important because as I'm going to show you, I'm going to connect to this Kali Linux machine via PuTTY. Alright, so I'm going to minimize VMware and I'm just going to open up PuTTY here. I already have it on my taskbar because I use it a lot. And as you can see, by default, the port is set to port 22. And now you can select the different connection type. We're using SSH. And I'm going to just enter the IP address 192.168.1.106. That's the IP address of the Kali Linux virtual machine. And I'm going to hit open. And it's going to open up this terminal and it's going to ask me, it's going to say that the server's host key is not cached. That's because we have not created the SSH keys, which we'll be looking at in future videos. So I'm just going to hit yes. And it's going to say login as. Now it's essentially asking me for my username. So I'm logging in as root. And it's going to ask me for the password. And I'm going to say, I'm going to enter my password. I think that's the password. That should be the password now. For some reason, that's not working. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to exit the connection. I'm going to try that again and log in from my other username, which is Alexis. All right, so 106 like so, and I'm just going to open connection and I'm just going to say Alexis and the password. There we are. All right, so we essentially we have got connection now, and as you can see, we can now perform Linux commands and we have access to the Kali Linux virtual machine. So if I list the files, you can see that we have the default directory. So I'm just going to go backwards to the home directory and I'm just going to go back and list all the files. And there we are. You essentially have connection to the Kali Linux virtual machine. And that's why SSH is so important because you can actually connect and use your virtual machine remotely or on your local area network. So it's really awesome. And that is how to start up the different services like Apache 2 and SSH, which are going to be very important as we move on. Alright, so that is section 2 in a wrap where we looked at working with Kali Linux. Alright, so now let's look at a summary of what we've gone through in this section. Alright, so we started off with installing our virtualization tools. In this case, we went on and installed VMware tools on Kali Linux, and we were able to get full access of the virtual machine. Alright, we then moved on to updating Kali Linux, where we looked at updating the repositories, the packages, and then finally the entire distribution. We then moved on to setting up proxy chains and configuring the proxy chains file, and after that we moved on to installing Tor and finally starting the Tor service and proxy chains, giving us anonymity as we were passing or tunneling our traffic through the Tor relay. Right after that, we looked at starting our different network services, for example SSH and Apache, that were very essential, and we also learned how to start the different services on Kali Linux. Alright, to wrap up the section, we looked at a quick win where we were looking at WordPress hacking with WordPress scan. So we used WordPress scan to brute force a login on WordPress. Alright, so that was section 2 in a wrap, and in the next section, we will be looking at information gathering. So I'll be seeing you in the next section.